Is voter registration part of the HUD mission?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. In reference to the Hatch Act, normally we would turn over allegations around the Hatch Act to the Office of Special Counsel, and I haven't seen any guidance out on that in the department as of yet.
I don't think you'll see any coming from the administration about it this time. I would ask that you take a look at Hatch Act, particularly with respect to voter registration drives and the potential for ballot harvesting drop boxes at HUD properties. Could you do that?
I'm happy to look into that issue and find out more about it.
Do you know whether or not those rat-infested apartments owned by Mr. Kushner are still in Baltimore?
The FHFA's approval of Freddie Mac's proposal to purchase second mortgages and the Fannie Mae title acceptance pilot are both potentially problematic ways of pushing the GSEs into other private markets that have nothing to do with their core mission.
He was afraid, he said, of, well, I'm not going to use the word, I call them undocumented immigrants. Others use some inhumane terms that begin with I. I don't want to hear about expertise or anything.
Despite Director Thompson's recent claim that no vendors have been chosen for the pilot program, my office has reviewed documents shared with mortgage lenders by Fannie Mae, which explicitly named Doma Holdings as the vendor for their new title waiver pilot program.
I just want to know about the Hatch Act. You know, the Biden administration issued an executive order to have every federal agency engage in voter registration. Is voter registration part of the HUD mission?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. In reference to the Hatch Act, normally we would turn over allegations around the Hatch Act to the Office of Special Counsel, and I haven't seen any guidance out on that in the department as of yet.
I don't think you'll see any coming from the administration about it this time, but frankly, in the past, inspectors general have held people from both parties liable for violations of the Hatch Act. In fact, you know, that's happened just as recently as the last administration within HUD. So I would ask that you take a look at Hatch Act, particularly with respect to voter registration drives and the potential for ballot harvesting drop boxes at HUD properties. Could you do that?
I'm happy to look into that issue and find out more about it.
And I think it lies pretty well outside the mission of housing and urban development. So I really appreciate that.
Ms. Davis, is registering voters a political act? I mean, I know telling residents in public housing how to vote is, but the registration part.
Congressman, I'm not sure I can be helpful in this area. I don't really have all the facts. I don't have expertise in this particular area to offer. I'm happy to listen to the subcommittee member's concerns on this and learn more if I can.
I'm not concerned. You know, having lived in public housing, I know I don't ever remember my parents going up to the office to get a ballot on how to vote.
What do we need to do in Congress to speed up the process? And I notice you had commitments that were going to improve, or I guess look into the complaints. What kind of timetable and what kind of, I guess, ramifications if they do not comply?
Congressman, are we talking about open recommendations? Yes. One thing that we have done at HUD OIG is we have really focused in on priority recommendations. You know, as other members have cited, we have a large number of recommendations that we've made to the department. So what we try to do is really focus on the ones that can make the most difference. I would draw the subcommittee's attention to those things like elevated blood levels in children in public housing, things like IT concerns over security when there's PII at risk. In terms of the recommendations, we have a process that we follow internally. And sometimes that process leads to agreement and sometimes it leads to disagreement. One thing that I am very much hoping to do as the head of my agency is be in control of the closure of those recommendations.
Obviously, there's a scale difference between HUD and FHFA as far as our open recommendations. As of just yesterday, we were only at 42, which within the last 2 years that I've taken office, the FHFA has closed 98, and of that, about half of those were ones that had been recommended during my tenure. Director Thompson came to me early on her own and acknowledged the open recommendations and had committed to me that she was working to close them and implement them as quickly as possible. So by and large, I've been pleased with the response that we've gotten from the agency, and certainly nobody on my staff has raised any particular concerns. So we're working to close them as fast as possible. Some are easier than others. Some could be just a quick update of training to a certain group of people. Others could involve IT infrastructure changes that will just take time. But all in all, I've been pleased with the closure pace in my agency.
So they're not only giving you responses, they're giving you actions that are correcting the recommendations to make the agency better.
Correct. So the process is once we make a recommendation, it is on FHFA to then implement that. Once FHFA believes that they have fully implemented it, they reach back out to the team, the audit team or the evaluation team that made the recommendation. We make the determination of whether they satisfy that recommendation. And once they do, we then close the recommendation as implemented.
Okay, Congress.
It appears that the Kushner family owned thousands of apartments that were considered rat infested and other kinds of problems. Do you know whether or not those rat infested apartments owned by Mr. Kushner are still in Baltimore?
I can't speak to those specific properties or the specific units.
I can't hear you.
I cannot speak to those specific properties or those specific units.
Have you had complaints about rat-infested apartments in Baltimore, Maryland, or in Virginia that were owned by Mr. Kushner or his family?
I would need to do some internal data gathering to verify whether or not we have in fact had complaints about that.
The president just a few days ago said it was a mess. It was terrible. Have you thought about looking into it since the former president said that it was a mess, Baltimore was a mess?
We have a pretty robust portfolio in terms of decent, safe, and sanitary issues involving public housing and HUD-assisted housing, and we're always looking to hear about more issues. We're certain they're out there.
How long have you been Inspector General?
Since the beginning of 2019.
And have you conducted any investigations on rat-infested apartments in Virginia or in Baltimore?
We have, again, a remarkable portfolio in this area. I can't speak to specifics on rats or mold, although we do hear about that quite a bit nationwide. That's not an unusual complaint that we would get.
Mr. Tomney, does your office have any plans to investigate the FHFA and is following, whether or not they're following APA with its policy change announcements?
Thank you for the question. We have not done work in that specific space. As I said to the chairman earlier today, we are currently engaged in our risk analysis leading into future products, and so hearing from stakeholders like yourself today is certainly something we'll be looking at, and happy to work with you, and stay tuned.
Thank you. Former Director Mark Calabria issued a proposed rule of prior approval for enterprise products, proposed rule that was subsequently finalized by Director Thompson. This rule is an important guardrail, as you know, to ensure that the GSEs do not inappropriately expand their footprint in the housing market and displace true private capital. FHFA recent 2023 report to Congress noted that between April 28, 2023 and April 28, 2024, during that year, FHFA completed its review of 10 new activities and based on factors set forth in the regulation, determined the 3 should be treated as new products that merit public notice and comment. Do you plan to issue a report assessing compliance with prior approval for enterprise products final rule?
It's certainly something we're looking at. We've not made that decision yet, but I'm certainly familiar with the topic that you're speaking about, and is going to be a continued topic for us moving forward.
And last,
can you discuss some of the recommendations OIG has had for HUD in terms of lead-based hazards in public housing?
Well, thank you so much for drawing attention to this issue. This is part of my environmental justice initiative that I released last year, We've been working very closely with the Department of Justice. They've actually included us in their environmental justice policy. We've been working so closely over time now. In terms of lead, we've made a number of priority recommendations that remain open that we think will make a difference. You know, first and foremost, we want the department to get their arms around the problem. We want them to understand the number of units that might potentially have lead, and that's so that they can adequately resource their oversight of that issue. We're also looking at some of the tools they have in place to track elevated blood lead levels like you're talking about. They have a tool in place, but we know there are variances in it. For instance, we see EBLLs concentrated in certain states, but we know that, to your point, that housing stock is old throughout the country. So it would be unusual to see just certain states have a higher level of EBLLs. So we think they need to address that issue.
I'd like to start with FHFA's approval of a couple of potentially worrying pilot programs. The FHFA's approval of Freddie Mac's proposal to purchase second mortgages and the Fannie Mae title acceptance pilot are both potentially problematic ways of pushing the GSEs into other private markets that have nothing to do with their core mission. As we know, inspectors general are not necessarily in a policy-making role, but they are a good source of oversight, and in some cases we have questions about whether FHFA is following its own rules. In a Senate banking hearing, Director Thompson indicated that the pilot did not have to go through the products rule because it was a quote-unquote credit underwriting decision. Mr. Tomney, could the OIG review instances where FHFA bypassed the prior approval for enterprise products rule by labeling a GSE program simply a quote-unquote credit underwriting decision?
Thank you for the question. We've not looked at that, particularly since the new rule was finalized last year. We're currently going through our process to plan new products in the coming months and towards the end of the year. And this topic is one I'm familiar with, and we're certainly going to keep talking about it.
Well, thank you. It would be exceptionally unnerving if the FHFA could use this quote-unquote credit underwriting decision excuse to avoid compliance with new products rule. Frankly, you could classify any number of activities as related to credit underwriting. Where does the loophole end is one of my questions. The GSEs are already housing behemoths that have their hands in all parts of our housing ecosystem. If they're able to offer new products without even going through the new products rule, then we're going to see them continue to expand. Everyone in this committee is well aware that the GSEs are not fully private entities. They are still in conservatorship. If they are interested in expanding into new markets, they should be spun out of conservatorship first. They cannot have their cake and eat it too by remaining in place with implicit federal backing and also cannibalize existing markets that have nothing to do with their charter. Neither the pilot nor the second mortgage pilot have anything to do with expanding access to housing or affordable housing. In fact, the second mortgage pilot could run directly contrary to those goals by speeding up inflationary pressures that are already making our housing market incredibly expensive. I'd like to briefly pivot to HUD. Last month, we had two witnesses testify regarding waste and fraud at the public housing authorities. In both cases, the people that came to testify in front of the committee experienced retaliation for telling their stories. My understanding is that Congress already passed a law protecting against this kind of retaliation for contractors, subcontractors, grantees, and subgrantees. That statute is Title 41, Section 4712 of the United States Code. Ms. Davis, would public housing authorities which receive federal appropriations be subject to those protections from reprisal?
Yes, they should be. They should fall under 4712 as employees of a grantee.
I know there's been an issue with amending contracts before and after the passage of this law in 2013. In the case of our witnesses last month, one was actually hired well after the 2013 cutoff. That individual indicated they were not aware of any whistleblower protections in place for them. For someone, particularly someone who is not a federal employee, how are they made aware that these anti-reprisal rules apply to them?
That should fall within the responsibility of the department as the contractual relationship and the grantee relationship stands.
I want to start by first clarifying some of the comments that were made earlier by some of my colleagues. It didn't surprise me that both of you were not aware of any Hatch Act, direct Hatch Act violations at public housing or properties owned or financed by your organizations. And it didn't surprise me that you weren't aware of any harvesting of any voters. It seems to be something that the Secretary of State of Mississippi said in response to the president's recent executive order. And in fact, he was afraid, he said, of, well, I'm not going to use the word, I call them undocumented immigrants. Others use some inhumane terms that begin with I, and also convicted felons. Are you all, either one of you, aware, and just a yes or no, I don't want to hear about expertise or anything, just yes or no. Are you aware of any allegations or complaints having been made to any one of your agencies, either directly or indirectly, about voter fraud or voter harvesting or hat check violations?
No.
No.
What actions can HUD take to further compel NYCHA to make serious and sustainable reforms?
Well, we have a whole host of priority recommendations in our portfolio that apply to PHAs in general, which would also apply to NYCHA. They need to hold NYCHA accountable in that way. They need to work with the monitor who's in place to get data on the present circumstances and then hold their feet to the fire with those outstanding recommendations. I also think as we go forward, the implementation of Inspire, while is good in theory, we will all be anxious to see how it rolls out and to see if it does answer all these problems that are known in the public housing arena.
And what lessons can we learn from the failures of NYCHA to prevent similar corruption and lawlessness at other housing authorities?
You know, I think fraud risk management is something that we have been doing a lot of work in, and we are in fact in the process of doing a fraud risk management audit at NYCHA. Certainly, PHAs need some flexibilities, but they have to have some controls in place, and they have to have some guardrails that people can't push through. I'm hoping that that audit will be very beneficial, certainly to NYCHA and to other PHAs.
You may be aware that earlier this year, the White House directed FHFA to revive a pilot program relating to title insurance waivers. While I hold concerns with the end goals of the pilot program itself, I hold even deeper concerns as to how DOMA Holdings, the chosen vendor for the program, obtained this contract. To recap, when FHFA was considering this pilot last year, DOMA was on the brink of bankruptcy and faced potential delisting from the New York Stock Exchange. Furthermore, the company's technology is not innovative and ranks low within the industry. The only distinguishing feature of DOMA appears to be its political connections, notably with former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers serving on its board and being a shareholder. Despite Director Thompson's recent claim that no vendors have been chosen for the pilot program, my office has reviewed documents shared with mortgage lenders by Fannie Mae, which explicitly named DOMA Holdings as the vendor for their new title waiver pilot program. I'm happy to provide these documents to you and your staff if you are unaware of their existence. Credit is due to Director Thompson. When I inquired about this questionable arrangement last summer, she testified that a partnership between Fannie Mae and DOMA, quote, does not sound safe or sound, end quote. Shortly after our hearing, she contacted the CEO of Fannie Mae and instructed her to suspend the pilot program because of the hearing. Months later, that decision was overridden by the White House. So, Mr. Tomney, this is my question. As the FHFA's Inspector General, I urge you to investigate what led this pilot program to be revived despite FHFA's objections just last year. The public deserves to know who at the White House directed FHFA to revive this program and whether Larry Summers communicated with administration officials. So the question is, are you currently investigating this? And if not, will you commit to doing so?
I would certainly welcome you sharing that information with my staff. As I've mentioned a short time ago, we're currently planning our future products. To the extent that there'd be any open investigations, it's nothing that I'd be able to speak to in this setting, but I welcome you and your staff to provide that information to mine. I appreciate it.
We will get you those documents. And one more point, additionally, a recent Politico article reported irregularities in DOMA's stock price immediately prior to President Biden's announcement of the title insurance waiver program during his State of the Union address. And while I'm confident that the SEC is examining this apparent insider trading, is the FHFA investigating whether non-public information was shared with Mr. Summers or other members of the DOMA board?
Again, I don't have any information on that, but again, welcome you sharing anything with my staff.
The hearing is now adjourned.